And here we have basically the completed gun mount and gun barrel assembly. The mantlet, as I mentioned before, is the new early version from eastcoastarmory.com, while the barrel, as well as all of the internals, are modified from the Armortek. Now, like I mentioned before, this unit here is really comprised, it's really a Frankenstein unit, and it mixes parts and components from the first generation M4A4 release combined with the current 5C Firefly release. Because of that, some modifications need to have been made to a lot of the components. Starting with the mount itself, because of the earlier style mount, the whole unit had to have been elevated from the resin mount by about 1/2 of an inch. 2 resin 1/2 of an inch spacers were fabricated and were mounted securely to the mantlet. To secure them on, I went ahead and opted for not only fasteners, but also some very strong adhesives, namely Gorilla Glue. This is one portion of the build where I'm absolutely serious about not having any type of movement or play in once the piece is assembled. With the glue and the fasteners, the unit is completely sturdy and is very strong. The 2 brass mounts, like I mentioned before, are firmly bolted into the mount along with the strong adhesive. The entire trunnion, it just pivots on these 2 large Allen bolts that we have here. The trunnion itself has the new version of the Armortek unit fitted to the vehicle. That includes the turret or the gun elevation mechanism, as well as the bracket that was originally for the gun recoil. Some modifications were made, namely this portion here of the bracket was originally integral bent into this portion here. Because of the longer trunnion, the portion had to have been trimmed or else it would have hit the back portion of the turret. I trimmed the metal away. This part here, the bracket, was then modified so that the airsoft gun actually bolts to it and keeps it firmly in its place. The trunnion and the bracket had to have been modified so that they could mount to each other, as the original holes did not line up on these 2 parts here. As you can see, nylocks and Loctite along with some lock washers have also been used on this location. Just like with the mantlet, this is another location where play is absolutely not needed and not wanted. So with the added nylocks and lock washers, it firmly keeps all the components assembled that you see here. As for the servo, in the integral servo mount that was mounted on the tray, this unit will be recycled for another purpose, of which I'll have more information on that to come. As for mounting that, this was modified to fit onto the original elevation motor mount, which was for the first M4A4 release. Since the motor will not be needed in this location here, the mount lends itself as a perfect location to affix the servo tray and the servo mount that was removed from the other bracket. Now that the unit is completely painted, it is now ready for its elevation stops, which will be added very soon. Another modification that needed to be made was inside the trunnion and also in the barrel. Because of the smaller diameter of the airsoft BB barrel, the integral barrel here, the integral hole here had to have been slightly enlarged in order for the piece to slip in. Also, within the hollow recesses of the barrel and the trunnion, there are small resin spacers that are positioned along the inside. Purposes of the spacers is it keeps the airsoft pencil barrel nice and true throughout the length of the barrel so that the BB exits from the center of the muzzle as opposed to hitting or striking the edge of the barrel. While on the barrel itself had its CNC marks removed on the lathe with some emery cloth. After a few passes, the CNC marks were completely sanded away and the barrel is totally smooth. Also included with the resin set is the addition of the end cap. Not only, because of the 1/2 inch spacer that needs to be affixed to the back portion of the mantlet, the gun needed to have another 1/2 inch added to the front of the muzzle. If not, the barrel might have been slightly too short. There's a small little resin plug that inserts into the Armortek barrel. Purpose of that serves as two purposes. One, it gives you the extra 1/2 inch that was lost because of the trunnion. Another thing that it does is that it replaces the out of scale hole that's on the stock barrel with the integral threads with that of a more appropriate barrel end, along with the emergency crosshair lines that we have here on the barrel's end. As for the elevation of the gun itself, that's facilitated by this geared motor here. Armortek supplies with a very nice pre-wired geared motor, along with a pressed, very thick, very strong sheet metal L bracket. Now, because of the longer trunnion of the main gun from the original M4A4 release, the location for the spindle was not going to work for this application, so it needed to be lower. To lower it, I just went ahead and on the drill press, I kept the same holes for the mounting screws. I just simply flipped the motor upside down and drilled the hole on the angle plate for the new lower stance of the spindle. After some dry fitting, the gun was able to elevate with the unit as it would have on the original Armortek kit. As for the power cable to control the elevation motor, just like on all Armortek tanks, that's facilitated with the turret subloom. Subloom itself is a long piece of cable. One end has a simple plug jack, while on the other end it has two jacks as well as two limit switches. The purpose of the two jacks is that one jack is designed for that of the gun elevation, while the other jack would have been used for either the blank firing system on the older units, or what's more commonly found on Armortek kits today, that of the gun recoil system. The jacks themselves are pre-wired, and as a nice touch, are patterned differently, so that there's no chance of accidentally plugging the wrong jack to the wrong location. As for the limit switches, the purpose of them is so that the gun will stop once it hits a certain point. This is a nice feature in that your gun barrel elevation won't overstretch itself, which can cause damage to the unit as well as the electronics. The way they work is that they bolt on to a plate either on the turret or on, in this case on the Sherman, on the mantlet. One gets fitted to the top and to the bottom, and once properly hooked up, when the gun hits a certain point, it triggers the switch, and it will no longer allow the motor to rotate in that direction. It will only allow the motor to rotate in the reverse direction, thus having the barrel switch directions. As for which switch goes where orientation-wise, the best way to find this out is to actually bench test the system when plugged into the tank. This way, once everything is assembled, you don't have to go ahead and make the mistake on having the switches switched on you. As for mounting on the subloom, on these Armortek Shermans, specifically the M4A4, it was located on a steel little plate that was originally bolted on to the brass mount over here. On the original M4A4, it only used two large Allen screws, which served both to sandwich the mount to the piece, but also mounted the whole unit to the stock mantlet. Because of the extra 1/2 inch spacer, the fasteners needed to be lowered into the unit, so counterwells were drilled in. Once the counterwells were drilled in, the old style of mounting the plate to the spacer to the pivot block was no longer viable. What was done in its place, a new plate was fabricated out of plate steel, and the brass pivot block itself had two new holes drilled into it that were tapped. Once they were tapped, two fasteners along with lock washers and Loctite were used to secure the whole plate to the mantlet. Now that the plate is secured on, the holes that are drilled into the plate are specifically sized so that the limit switches can bolt to them without any issues. After the unit is bench tested, the limit switches will be permanently mounted to the plate. And here goes basically the completed unit, about ready for installation. Here we have the limit switches now installed. Now if you notice, the switches have to be bent, the levers on them have to be bent slightly in order so that you get the right adjustment for the limit for the up and down travel of the gun. As for which works best, that is really up for you, the builder, to decide. The pieces simply just get bent with a plier and you just tweak it until you're happy with the end result. As for the airsoft gun, it too is now fixed to the trunnion, and the way that's facilitated is with a single hex bolt that mounts onto the original mounting lug, which would have been used for the Heng Long tank. On this model, only one of the lugs is retained. As for the other lug, needed to be removed in order for it to fit besides the elevation mount that we have here. Also added is the coaxial M1919 machine gun barrel. Because this is the early style mantlet, the M1919 barrel is exposed and protrudes from the mantlet cover. On later versions, there was a protective shoe that protected the barrel from any sort of damage. When I was assembling the gun, I noticed that the bolts, once mounted to the trunnion, would actually pivot with the trunnion and were not connected to the main mounting block that we have here. Because of that, this made a perfect location to mount on the equipment for the M1919, in that the center pivot portion here is actually where the gun pivots, and so if tapped into this, the gun will move simultaneously with that of the main gun. By connecting it to the center bolt, this alleviates any type of machinery that needs to be added to facilitate the same movement. It's not only perfectly in line with the barrel, but since it's a passive system, no extra design work and clutter will be needed on the interior portion of the turret. Here we can see the gun moving up and down simultaneously with the main gun. This adds for a nice realistic feature, specifically once the tank is built and painted. And here we have the gun and the mantlet system now mounted to the vehicle. Now, to mount on the new replacement mantlet to the turret, that mounts on in the exact same format as did on the kit original, and that is with the use of fasteners. No adhesives are used for this application. One difference that I made to the kit installation of the mantlet, which differs from the kit original, is the type of fasteners that are used. On the original kit, for mounting on the mantlet to the turret, that is done with the use of hex bolts. However, on the real Sherman tank, slot screws were used for this application. As for obtaining the bolts themselves, if anyone wants to perform a similar modification, the bolts that I found were in Radio Shack, and they are located in the wire connection section, in a little drawer. As for the size, here I have the corresponding nuts for them, and it is 4x40. That is the pattern of machine screws that I used. By simply swapping out the machine screws, or the hex bolts with the machine screws, it gives the model a lot more of a realistic look and appearance to it, as opposed to the kit original hex bolts. Also, the only parts that are threaded for the metric are the holes that are located in the trunnion for the four mantlet mounting holes that we have here. As for mounting on the rotor drum to the tank itself, those holes are just simply drilled in and are not tapped. You simply put the fastener through the piece and you sandwich it with a nut on the other end. So in addition to picking up the pack of fasteners, I also recommend picking up the bag of corresponding nuts to go with it. Now that the gun and mantlet have been mounted into the vehicle, it's time to see what it looks like once everything is installed. Now keep in mind this is a lot different compared to both the kit original M4A4 and the kit supplied parts for the 5C Firefly. First we'll start with the hopper. If we notice, the hopper is right over the commander's scapula. Now keep in mind this tank will be receiving the early style split hatch. Because of that, the split hatch, one little detail the split hatch has over the later version is that the split hatch has a wider entry hole in it, which for this case, which will allow a lot more easy access to the model's hopper to load in the BBs. As you can see, I already preloaded the unit to test fire it. Now that the unit is self-contained, I don't have, like I mentioned before, I don't have to worry about any spillage or BBs bouncing around on the inside of the tank if the tank were to drive on rough terrain. Peeking our way on the inside through the ejection port, we could see here the elevation system now fully mounted into the tank. There goes the elevation motor, and the motor is mounted to the bracket as well as the other steel bracket that was fabricated for the installation. As we can see, the steel bracket is mounted to the turret via two very large fasteners that are held in place via Loctite as well as nylock nuts. The purpose of the extra security of the nylock nuts is to keep this unit properly in its place, as any type of play and wiggle is unacceptable for the tank's performance. Again, while peeking into the 75mm ejection port, we can take the opportunity to watch the elevation system in action from the inside of the vehicle. Now the tank is currently on, and the gun is currently bottomed out. If I apply the signal to lower the gun, the piece will refuse to go down any lower because of the impact switch that I mentioned earlier. So I will now attempt to raise the gun. If we notice, the elevation motor is rotating, and since it's connected to this brass bush, this large brass mound here, the brass mound is going closer to the motor via the threads, and since it's on this track, and the track is connected to the bracket which is connected to the gun will elevate. Over here we can see that the elevation is at its maximum point. If I apply the signal, the impact switch refuses to let the motor activate, and will only have the gun go in the reverse direction. Currently, the only thing that needs to be added now to the elevation system is a little smeared grease on the threads, as well as possibly a little bit of lubricant on the track itself. And here goes the elevation from the outside of the vehicle. Currently, the barrel is in its furthest most depressed state. When I go ahead and raise it, you will also notice not only the gun elevating, but also the coaxial M1919 machine gun. As you can see, the airsoft gun fires remotely, and that is via this long toggle switch over here. If I flick it up, the firing unit will go ahead and go through its cycle. Now if you notice, the unit is automatic. So after the unit is fired, you have to manually turn the switch off. However, because the cyclic rate on the motor is so slow, getting single shots out of the cannon is very easy. Besides the toggle switch on the radio, the airsoft gun also has a manual shutoff that's located here on the rear control panel. Now, as we can see, the rear control panel has been temporarily disassembled, as it will be getting more toggle switches for more functions that are going to be added to this unit as the build progresses. To kill the main gun, there's this red topped push button switch here. You just click that, and no matter how much you hit the radio, the unit will not fire. To power the airsoft gun runs on its own independent battery source. For that, it uses a basic 7.2 battery, which gets harnessed to the vehicle in this location here. To just change the battery, you just clip it in to the internal jack and place it into the spring battery holder. As for the actual firing of the airsoft gun, that's facilitated by the servo apparatus that's located in the tank's hull. The servo itself is connected to an impact switch, and they're both mounted on a shop-made fabricated mount. The mount is then mounted to the vehicle and keeps everything nice and sturdy in place. The way the system works is very simple. When you hit the switch, the servo pivots, makes contact with the impact cherry switch, and thus causing the airsoft motor to run its cycle. With the addition of these new parts to the tank, the conversion from 5C Firefly back to M4A4 is now just about complete. And with that, that concludes this project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek M4A4 Sherman tank. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook, and don't forget to check out eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 scale tank builds, as well as other 1/6 scale detail components. Thank you.